Historically speaking, one of the most popular arguments for the existence of God has been the argument from contingency. And in many ways, this is still one of the most popular arguments today. Now, I've already covered a version of this argument in my video on Aquinas' Third Way, but today I'm going to be talking about a different variation, one that more closely resembles the argument presented by the philosopher G.W. Leibniz in the 17th century. In particular, I'm going to be drawing pretty heavily on a variation of the contingency argument offered by the philosopher Edward Feser in his book 5 Proofs of the Existence of God, which closely resembles Leibniz's approach. This argument, like many arguments for the existence of God, starts with the basic observation that things exist. Now, many people think that in order for the contingency argument to work, you have to start by making grandiose claims about how the universe as a whole exists, and proceed from talking about the universe to talking about the existence of God. But I don't think you necessarily have to do this. I think the argument works just as well if you start with the simple, everyday things of our experience. You start with how they exist, and then you proceed from there to the existence of God. And because I'm an oldies music guy, I'm going to start with an observation about how a Perry Como CD exists. So, this Perry Como CD exists. Now, as soon as I held this up, you probably had a bunch of questions. Who's Perry Como? What's he doing on a CD cover? I mean, do people even use CDs anymore? And these are all wonderful questions. But I think the most important question you could ever ask about anything that exists is, why does it exist? So, why does the Perry Como CD exist? And I think there's 3 basic ways to answer the question of why this CD or anything else exists. Number 1, you could say that there's no explanation for why the CD exists. It just is, and that's all. You can't ask any more than that. Or you could say that 2, there is an explanation for why the CD exists, and the explanation is found in the CD itself. There's something in the nature of the Perry Como CD which explains why it exists as a Perry Como CD. Or 3, you could say there's something outside the Perry Como CD which explains how it exists as a Perry Como CD. Now, the first answer I don't think is ever a good answer. I don't think it's ever a sufficient explanation of why a thing exists to say there's no explanation for why the thing exists. And the reason for this has to do with something called the principle of sufficient reason. Now, the term principle of sufficient reason is just a fancy name to describe a principle that all of us use every day, all the time, without really thinking about it. And that's the idea that for everything that exists, there exists a reason sufficient to explain the fact that that thing exists. And because this is so intuitive to us, I'm not going to spend a lot of time defending it, but I am going to try to show you exactly what it would look like if this principle wasn't true, just to show you how clear it is that this principle is correct. So remember, the principle of sufficient reason states that for everything that exists, there exists a reason sufficient to explain the fact that that thing exists. So if the principle of sufficient reason wasn't the case, that means that there would have to be things which can exist without a sufficient reason for their existence. And if that was the case, we would expect to see these kinds of things all the time. We would expect to see things just coming into being and going out of being with absolutely no explanation. And we don't. I mean, imagine if I was sitting here and all of a sudden, bling, a giant floating, glowing orb just sprung into being right in front of me. I think my first question would be something along the lines of, where did this come from? What explains this thing's existence? And if you said, oh no, there's just no explanation, there's just a flying glowing orb now, that's just it, I would look at you like you're crazy, because that just doesn't happen. Orbs just don't boing out of nowhere. There has to be an explanation. And if there's nothing in my immediate surroundings that allows this orb to exist and explains the orb's existence, well, then I would start looking for more and more exotic explanations for how this orb could come into existence. I would point to aliens or robots or advanced civilizations time traveling to put an orb here or something like that. I would instinctively assume that there's an explanation, because there's always an explanation. Whenever we see something, there's always an explanation for why it exists. So the principle of sufficient reason is on really solid grounds. So option number 1 is off the table. It just isn't the case, and it can't be the case, that the Perry Como CD exists with absolutely no explanation. So that leaves option 2 and option 3. Option 2, if you remember, is the idea that the Perry Como CD is explained by something inside itself, that it's in the very nature of a Pericomo CD to exist as a Pericomo CD. If that was the case, we would say that the Pericomo CD is necessary, that it's not dependent upon anything else to exist. It is the full explanation of its own existence. If that's not the case, and if option 3 is correct, we would say the Pericomo CD is contingent. If a thing is contingent, that means it depends upon something else for its existence, that there's an explanation for why it exists outside of the thing itself. So, the way we can phrase our question now is the Pericomo CD contingent or necessary? And I think when we really think about this question, we have to say that it's contingent. After all, there's so many things about the Pericomo CD that suggest that it's dependent upon other things for its existence. I mean, at one point, this CD was just spare parts in a factory. The factory had to put those parts together for the CD to exist at all. And if I wasn't careful and I stepped on this CD, I wasn't looking where I was going, I mean, first of all, it would be tragic, but also it would mean there would be no more Pericomo CD. This CD is dependent upon me not stepping on it in order to exist. This CD is just the kind of thing that can be changed. And all those things that have the ability to change the Pericomo CD, the Pericomo CD is dependent on. It's dependent on those things not changing it in order for it to continue existing as a Pericomo CD. All right, here's where the argument gets interesting. I think that there's a really good case to be made that everything in the material world is just like the Pericomo CD. Everything in the material world is contingent. Why is that? Well, because I think matter is necessarily changing. Matter is necessarily the kind of thing that can be changed. Matter is constantly decaying, it's constantly moving itself, it's constantly in flux. And if a thing's in flux, then there's something else that puts it in flux, which means that the matter is dependent upon that thing which can put it in flux, not putting it in flux at that moment in order for it to exist. The Pericomo CD is dependent upon the thing that has the ability to step on it, not stepping on it in order for it to exist. The tree is dependent on the guy who has the axe not chopping it down in order for it to continue existing as a tree. The planet, our Earth, is dependent upon our sun not going supernova right now in order for it to continue to exist. Our sun itself is dependent upon the pressures within it remaining stable in order for it to not go supernova. Everything that's material is in this constant state of contingency, this constant state of being at risk of being changed by something else. Okay, so everything in the material world is contingent. Here's where the argument gets even more interesting. Imagine that instead of just this one Pericomo CD, I had like 5 CDs stacked on top of each other. Here's my question to you. Would the stack of Pericomo CDs be any less contingent than just one CD? No. If anything, it would almost be more contingent because it depends on every single one of these imaginary CDs existing in order for it to continue existing as a stack of Pericomo CDs. So here's the principle I'm getting out of this. A group of contingent things, a collection of contingent things, doesn't stop becoming contingent when it becomes a collection of contingent things. If anything, it becomes more contingent. So, when we look at the material world, we've already said that the material world is a collection of contingent things because everything in the material world is contingent. So here's the question for you. If the material world is a collection of contingent things, and a collection of contingent things is just as contingent as the contingent things that make it up, doesn't that mean the material world itself is contingent? And if that's the case, doesn't that mean that it needs an explanation external to itself to explain its existence? But the only thing external to the material world is something which is not material or immaterial. So there has to exist something which is immaterial, which explains the existence of the material world. Okay? If there's something which is immaterial, then it's also possible for that thing to be unchangeable. Because remember, I said material things are necessarily changing. Not everything is necessarily changing. Material things are necessarily changing. So if there's something which isn't material, it's at least possible for this thing to be unchanging. And let's think about what it would mean if this thing was unchanging. Well, if this thing was unchanging, it would also be possible for it to be necessary. And if this thing is necessary, then it can explain the existence of the material world without needing to be explained itself. This immaterial, unchanging thing isn't dependent upon anything else to exist. It just explains its own nature. It's the kind of thing which has a nature which explains its own existence. So this thing could answer the question, how does the material world exist at all? All right then, can we say anything else about this necessary thing? I think we can. And as we get into it, I think we're going to realize that this necessary thing looks very different from all the contingent things of our experience. Because in order for something to be necessary and unchangeable, that means that there can't be anything that it lacks. Because if you lack something, you can always gain that something. And if you gain that something, first of all, you change. And second of all, you become dependent on not getting that thing in order to stay the thing you are. So this thing can't lack anything. That means it has to have infinite existence, infinite being. And if it has infinite being, that means it can't lack any kind of real being. So it can't lack knowledge or power or goodness. So this thing has to be infinite being, all good, all knowing, and all powerful. Also, if this thing can't lack anything, then there can only be one of these things. Because the way we differentiate two different things of the same kind is that we say that one of them has something that the other one lacks. But if a necessary being can't lack anything, then there's no way to differentiate necessary being 1 from necessary being 2. So there can only be necessary being 1. So that means that it's the same one necessary being which explains the existence of all the material things. So we've now arrived at the existence of a immaterial, unchanging, all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing, infinite, existent, necessary, singular thing which holds together and sustains and creates everything in existence. So, once again, we have arrived at the existence of God.